Good evening and welcome to this evening with Hagai El-Ad from B'Tselem, which is the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in Occupied Territories. My name is Hagai El-Ad and I'm one of the founders of Gate 48, Critical Israelis in the Netherlands. And I'm very happy to see all of you here tonight. This evening with Hagai El-Ad is organized by Gate 48 with support of the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis and the Ella Stichting. I'll be very short. A few words on Hagai El-Ad, who is a human rights activist and the executive director of B'Tselem. Among many other international awards, the organization received the Dutch Geuzenpenning in 2009, and in 2015 they were one of the finalists of the Mensenrechten Tulp, the Tulip Human Rights Award, given by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It is seen as one of the most important human rights organizations in Israel. Tonight we will hear Hagai speak about 50 years of occupation, an occupation that was supposed to be temporary, but has developed to be a permanent regime. And he will talk about how Israel has managed, and in what way it has managed to keep this regime, and what policies lay behind it. Of course, after his talk there will be ample time for Q&A. As I said, I'm keeping it really short. We will start with a very short clip, and then I'll give the word to Hagai.
Hi, good evening. That video is a hard act to follow, but I'll do my best. Before anything else, I want to thank all of you for being here this evening, and I want to thank Gate 48 for giving me the opportunity to be in Amsterdam and to speak with you and to speak with others in this city and elsewhere in the Netherlands yesterday and today. It's been a very meaningful opportunity for me, and also I hope that this evening will be a continuation of that. So I will make some remarks in the spirit of what was introduced, and hopefully after that we'll be able to have a conversation. I would be very eager to that, so I'll also try and keep my comments not too long. I've been the director of B'Tselem for the past 2 years now. Before that, I was the director of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel for 6 years. Before that, I was the director of the Jerusalem Open House, the Gay and Lesbian Community Center in Jerusalem. Before that, I was in school. I was doing astrophysics. But one thing led to the other, and eventually here I am this evening. I've watched this video many times. It's produced by B'Tselem's video department. It has been active for just over a decade now, much through the work of more than 200 Palestinian volunteers empowered through this project of citizen journalism. And you saw this clip that whenever I see it again, I have this deep sense of shame each and every time that I see it, and it keeps haunting me as it tells in such a short time these powerful images from the occupation that I have a responsibility for, in the same way that any other Israeli citizen has a responsibility for. And we are here this evening, and it's just a few days before the 50th year of the occupation will begin in June, in a week or two. And that is symbolic moment in time that should make all of us pause and wonder, both on how did we get here, that this reality that was supposed to be temporary, and I'll talk a bit more about temporariness later in this presentation, how did we get to this point in time where I can still mention temporary after close to 50 years, and you're not all laughing hysterically. That word is apparently completely lost its meaning already a long time ago. 50 years, 49 years cannot be temporary, and how that idea is effectively used in order to propagate that reality. But that's looking back. And looking forward, of course, the question of action, I think for any person of decency, is like what should be done so that we are not looking towards this abyss of the next 50 years of occupation. And that fear, that nightmare weighs heavily on my shoulders, on my heart, and on the shoulders and hearts of any individual that is aware and attuned of this reality. The video that we watched demonstrates the presence of injustice, the presence of injustice. And there's another side for the same coin, which is the absence of justice, right? It may sound like the same thing, reflections of the same idea, but it's not the same. And with the 50 years, the presence of injustice are what is, creates those moments, sometimes moments of violence that do make images that are very visible and resonate in Israel and Palestine, sometimes resonate around the world. A bulldozer destroying a Palestinian home, a demonstration being dispersed violently by the Israeli army, and so on. All of those moments, and such as the moments that you saw in this video. But much of the work of the occupation is, and those moments and weeks and months and years, that are the absence of justice. And those moments, weeks, months, years, don't make for powerful video footage. So I want to invite you and imagine those moments, because most of the time, for many Palestinians, that is the ongoing reality. So for instance, you saw in the video clip a few seconds from a few Israeli soldiers entering a Palestinian home, right? And asking about the people, the teenagers, kids in the home. But the reality is that almost any Israeli soldier can enter almost any Palestinian home at any point in time. So what I want to invite you to imagine are not just the seconds where that fear becomes a reality, but to imagine living under that constant knowledge that is always an option that can materialize, that can take place. Just imagine how it is living like that. It doesn't make for compelling video footage, but that is like the ongoing reality. And you saw the picture at the end of the Palestinian family sitting in the wreckage of its home. That is very powerful imagery of a terrible moment. But again, what I invite you to imagine are the months and years that probably preceded that moment, and many similar such moments that Palestinian families, communities, villages endure all over the West Bank. The knowledge that at some point, maybe in a week, maybe in a few years' time, a bulldozer may come and destroy your home or your village, because there is a pending demolition order that may or may not take place, and it's in effect with regard to a certain part of the village, but not another part of the village, and you're not supposed to build in the meantime, and kind of like your life is frozen for months and sometimes for years, and you live under that constant risk all of the time. Like, just try to really put ourselves in the shoes of people that have to live under such a reality. And maybe while you're living in that village, and because Israel claims through one mechanism or another, and maybe I'll talk a bit more about that later, that village is illegal,
that it's a basis also not for the potential demolition, but also it's a basis for not connecting the village to the electricity grid, not connecting it to running water, and living under those conditions for a very long period of time. And maybe while you're living there, you can actually watch the electricity grid running not very far from where your home is, and that grid connects to the next Israeli settlement or maybe the next Israeli illegal outpost and so on. And regardless of the fact of whether they have a master plan or not, then they will get that infrastructure and you won't, and that is the reality. And again, if you just make an image of that, again, it's not very powerful or dramatic. Palestinian village, electricity grid, there's no violence, there's no shocking moment, there's nothing really to picture. But just picture that reality going on for years and years and years in the occupied territories. And I think I have taken the time to pause and reflect on that presence of injustice and the absence of justice, because for us as B'Tselem, we put huge emphasis on trying to tell Israelis, Palestinians, the world, the entire story. And the entire story is not just those captivating, horrible moments that sometimes open the evening news. It is that mundane reality that a lot of it is bundled in military regulations and endless court cases and various other orders and bureaucratic mechanisms that Israel uses in order to justify its policies and how to control and displace Palestinians in the occupied territories. Now, let me take a step back and focus on one specific aspect of that temporary reality, and again, one that wouldn't necessarily make for very interesting or compelling or dramatic video footage. So let's go back almost 50 years. Let's go back to 1967, when this temporary reality has begun. And I'll pause for a second on the legal framework that Israel has used since and is accepted in Israel. That has been the policy of Israeli governments, at least so far, and that is the general relevant legal international context for that reality, which is of temporary belligerent occupation. Emphasize on the word temporary. And with temporary belligerent occupation, what is supposed to happen, right? I mean, again, if you pause and think about it for a second, it seems to make a lot of sense, right? There has been an armed conflict, a new territory has been occupied by an army as a result of what preceded. Someone needs to run the territory for the interim duration until there is a political solution, right? You don't want to have a vacuum of power. So who will do that? The military commander. So that's the idea behind occupation law. And in that legal frame, the authority that the military commander has is very specific. In that imagined reality, the military commander is this benevolent temporary custodian that is running the occupied territory on behalf of the occupied people until they get back their own government, right? So that's one part of the military commander's authority. And the other part is to take care of urgent security needs. That's it. Now, I could insert now, a lengthy description of how the reality in the occupied territories is very different from, that, benevolent temporary custodian, right? Think about settlements and think about all of the other things that Israel does in order to advance its interests over the rights of Palestinians in the occupied territories. So certainly, we are not in a situation in which, Israel delegated that authority for the military commander that runs the West Bank to treat the territory in such a way. But just, go with me just for another minute and imagine a situation in which it would have been actually that way, right? No settlements, no taking advantage of the occupied land. If there would be, wrongdoings by Israeli soldiers, then there would be accountability and so on. Everything would have been perfect in that scheme, right? And the problem, one of the problems with that, is that there is no expiration date. No one invented an expiration date to that reality in international law. So because presumably people of good faith never imagined that there is even a possibility that such a situation would go on for such a long time, decade after decade, half a century by now, and who knows how much longer. So there is never a moment in which, in international law, that Palestinians get back that basic thing, political rights, like the ability to vote and to decide on their own government and on their own future, right? It just never happens. And of course that, I think again, any decent individual considering that situation would say, that's a lacuna that has to be fixed. Like at some point in time, it's ridiculous to think of this as temporary, and people have to get back their political rights. And of course, we don't have that. Palestinians don't have that. And in addition to that, adding pain to injury, of course, the military commander is not that benevolent custodian running the territory, serving the best interests of the occupied people. Now, if all that is not enough, then there is another aspect very specific to the situation with regard to voting rights in the occupied territories. And here I want to go back just a few years ahead in time. We started in 1967, the occupation, temporary related custodian, and not a very long time after 1967, in August of 1970, so, not a Netanyahu government, not a right-wing government, a few short years after the occupation began, and you might be astonished to discover that already at that time, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, decided to amend the voting law in Israel. So this is like, a small detail, but I think it's a very, or maybe not so small, but very telling about, temporariness and who had a vision more than 45 years ago already with regard to the future of the occupied territories. So in Israel, if you want to participate in the elections, we don't have, generally speaking, absentee voting. You need to be in the country to vote, unless you're an Israeli diplomat, or like very few such exceptions. Israeli students studying abroad, Israelis traveling abroad, living abroad, generally speaking. You want to vote in Israel, on election day, you need to fly back and vote on your registered address in Israel, right? There is, that's the way to do it. So if you're in New York or in Amsterdam, you're outside of Israel. You need to fly back. And if you're an Israeli settler in Ariel or elsewhere in the West Bank, well, you should have, at least drive back into Israel proper in order to vote, because there was no formal annexation of the occupied territories besides East Jerusalem. So that's, formally speaking, according to Israeli law, outside of Israel, and you cannot vote there, right? So, maybe coming back flying, especially to vote from Amsterdam is a big effort, and to do that from New York is even a bigger effort. And to drive from Ariel to Tel Aviv is a very small effort, but that's the least that you need to do, because otherwise you're not in the country, and there cannot be a ballot box there, and you cannot vote, right? But in 1970, the Israeli parliament amended the voting law, and they made this exception that your address can actually be not only registered in Israel, but also in the areas under Israel's control. Right? That was the small correction that was made. And since then, Israeli settlers living in the West Bank don't even need to drive back into Israel proper. Like those addresses have been incorporated into the registry possibilities in the Ministry of the Interior, and as a result of that, people can vote in the settlements since then. Right? Now, many years have passed since 1970, and you can do the math, how many years were there between 1948, when Israel was established, and 1970, and all of the elections that happened afterwards. By now, most of the years that the country existed, and most of the election cycles, most of the voting days that have transpired in the history of the State of Israel has been such in which settlers voted in the settlements. Okay? Now, it's also, I think, very telling to pause and be reminded that at the hearing in the Knesset in 1970, when the issue was discussed, one of the members of the Knesset tried to convince Parliament not to go ahead with the amendment. And he said that since at the time there was on the table, if I'm not mistaken, an American peace initiative, so many peace initiatives have come and gone since, but he said, my fellow members of the Knesset, there's a peace initiative, the whole issue is going to be resolved not in a very long time. Why make an amendment that in a few short years, or even less from that day, would become redundant, right? It's pointless to mess with the voting law for such a short period of time. But in retrospect, apparently, he was short-sighted, and the people, the members of the Knesset, the majority, that indeed insisted that that amendment be made, actually got it right, that it wasn't superfluous, it wasn't redundant, it wasn't temporary, and it has remained in effect, still is in effect, and again, has basically meant that in most of the days in which Israelis have voted, that has also meant that settlers in the settlement have voted, and when they have done that, and their neighbors, the Palestinians, of course, did not participate in the elections, it means that, I vote as an Israeli citizen, where I live in, these days in Jerusalem. I vote on, my future and also on the future of Palestinians. And the settlers that are doing that, participating in the same very elections, are voting, again, also specifically on the future of their neighbors that have no political say and no political rights. And that has been in effect for the majority of the life of the state of Israel. Okay. And I think also very specifically, when we think of the situation, so, I've said a few words about the concept of temporariness and how that has been used. And I want to pause and say a few words about the word democratic, right? And that's very relevant and very meaningful on several accounts. One of them is in the context of this, insistence, by Israelis when they think of their own identity, the identity of their country, identity of my country, and especially when they think of our relationships with the world, with other Western democracies, the issue of Israel, the concept of Israel as a functioning Western democracy, liberal democracy, is essential in that sense. And of course, it also means that in the mind of not a small number of Israelis, if you ask them about what is it with the occupation, then quite often the answer that you will get is that the occupation is democratic. Why is the occupation democratic? Because we voted and we've decided on that reality. And of course, even beyond the very ridiculousness of that concept, but even if you reduce democracy to just being the tyranny of the majority, and of course that is not a democracy, it's barely a formal democracy. But even if you do reduce it to that, then even the word the tyranny of the majority, well, I'm not so sure it's really the majority anymore when you think of all of the people that live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean and are subject to Israeli control. So not in many years' time, it will get to a point where it's not even that proper reduced version of a democracy, the tyranny of the majority. It will be the tyranny of the minority, right? Participating in that reality. So it is not temporary, and it has not been temporary for a long time, and it is not democratic, and it has not been democratic for a very long time. And that's where I will conclude, and that's, I think, also what brings that message and that tension here to Amsterdam, and to other places around the world. Because the reality that I've described is not an internal Israeli issue. If you would listen to statements more and more frequent by government ministers in Israel, then the point that they will try and insist making, if you will dare comment or criticize on certain aspects of Israel rule of Palestinians, then they will say that you are intervening in internal Israeli issues, and they would even dare say that you are undermining Israeli sovereignty, right? It has reached that level of cynicism, but at the same time, it's also very telling with regard to Israeli intentions vis-a-vis the future of the territories. So, but that's not true. We all know that that is not true. It is not a domestic internal Israeli issue. It is an issue of great international concern. It has always been such, and it will always remain such. And that is true always with regard to issues relating to human rights, which know no boundaries. They are universal in nature. And it is even more so correct when we're talking about human rights issues that are outside the borders of the State of Israel, happening not within the State of Israel. So on the universal level, and also specifically when you think about the reality, the specific reality there, then this is an issue of great international concern, and that is absolutely proper. And the question that I want to conclude with is the following one. If indeed Israel was a liberal democracy, then as you could read in various international documents, then that is the very basis for the very flourishing relationship that Israel has with the European Union, with member states of the EU, with the United States and other Western countries, right? That thought about a notion of shared values of democracy and human rights. And as I hope that I've managed to share with you and describe, I guess the polite understatement would be to comment that those shared values are deeply challenged and certainly deeply flawed in their expression, in the reality from which I come from, the reality under which Palestinians live. And the question, and with that I will really conclude, and we'll open it up for questions and a conversation with you, is that hence that this is actually the situation, what should follow as a result of that with regard to Israel's relations with itself, with its neighbors, and with the international community. Thank you very much.